Ad hominem is the name of a well-known fallacy type. The name is derived from Latin meaning to the man or to the person. It's the fallacy of rejecting a claim or an argument given by someone because we don't like something about the person. We're mistaking criticism of a person with criticism of a claim or an argument. There are several different kinds of ad hominem fallacies. In this video, we'll look at the most blatant form of ad hominem, the abusive ad hominem. Here's the most blatant form of this most blatant form of ad hominem. Your argument is bad because you suck. This is a fallacy because even if it's true that you suck, your sucking isn't relevant to the goodness or badness of your argument. If your argument is bad, it's bad because it has a dubious premise, or it has weak logic, or some other necessary condition for an argument to be good is violated. Your sucking might be a reason not to like you personally, but it's not a reason to reject your argument. Here's a less blatant and more challenging example. In his book Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler gives his account of race and history, and famously argues for the superiority of the Aryan race and the inferiority of Jewish people. Now, what if I said that we should reject Hitler's arguments because he was a mass murderer, or an insane megalomaniac, or racist and anti-Semitic, or whatever other nasty thing you want to say about him? Let's say that these nasty things are all true. Would these true facts about Hitler's character give us good reason to reject Hitler's arguments about racial differences? And here's a case where a lot of people, maybe most people, will say that this does give us good reason to reject his arguments. But if we accept that the ad hominem is indeed a fallacy, that it's a mistake to reject an argument based solely on qualities of the person giving the argument, then we have to reject the argument given here. This does not give us good reason to reject Hitler's arguments. Now, I think Hitler's arguments are bad, and I'm hoping that most people viewing this do too. But the point is that they're not bad because Hitler was bad. They're bad because they violate one or more of the necessary conditions for an argument to be good. This works the other way too, of course. If Mother Teresa gives an argument for giving charity and aid to the poor, and we think Mother Teresa is a moral saint, that shouldn't by itself count as a reason to accept her argument for giving aid to the poor. We wouldn't normally call this an ad hominem fallacy, of course, since the term is usually associated with criticism rather than praise. But it's still a fallacy, and for the exact same reasons. The problem isn't with criticism or praise, it's with confusing the judging of a person with the judging of an argument. Now, let's look at this example from an argument analysis perspective. Let's ignore the fact that we've already labeled it an ad hominem fallacy, and ask ourselves how we would normally assess the argument using the tools we've learned so far. Well, there are two basic questions to ask. Does the argument satisfy the truth condition, and does it satisfy the logic condition? In other words, number one, are all the premises true or plausible? And number two, is the argument valid or strong? If the answer to either of these is no, then the argument is bad. Well, premise one is clearly true. And premise two, well, it uses a lot of loaded and judgmental language, would be regarded as true, or at least defensible, by many people. As the argument is given, the problem isn't with the truth of the premises. As given, the problem is with the logic. If those two premises are true, the conclusion doesn't follow, either with certainty or with high probability. In other words, the logic of the argument is neither valid nor strong. It's weak. So, one way to evaluate this argument is simply to say that, as given, it's bad because the logic is weak. And that's true. But I want you to recall now the discussion about putting arguments in standard form way back in the first tutorial course on basic concepts in logic and argumentation. There, we emphasize that arguments are often presented as incomplete and rely on background assumptions to be interpreted correctly. An argument might be weak as given, but it might be relying on a background premise that would make it strong or valid. So in general, you're always encouraged to look for implicit background assumptions like this, and only evaluate the argument after you've reconstructed an argument. And that means making explicit any background assumptions that the argument is relying on. Only then should you go ahead and evaluate whether the argument is good or bad. So, does this argument rely on a background premise that makes the argument valid or strong? Well, it's not hard to see what would be required to make the logic work. Let's shrink this up so we have more room to work. You can often use a simple conditional claim, if A then B, or a generalization like all A or B, to fix the logic of an argument. So here, you might add a conditional claim like this. If Hitler was a murderous, megalomaniacal anti-Semite, then his arguments on racial superiority are very likely bad. If you add the very likely, then the argument is just strong. If you take it out, then it's valid. It's acceptable to add an assumed premise like this because it's clear that we're not putting words in the arguer's mouth. We have every reason to think that someone advancing this argument would accept a premise like that. So, with this reconstruction, we fixed the logical problem. It's not appropriate anymore to say that the argument is bad because the logic is weak. The logic is fine. The problem now is with the plausibility of that assumed premise. If this argument is bad, it's bad because this assumed premise is false or dubious. Now, this is a hard case for some people because it's still very tempting to think that this kind of character flaw is relevant to assessing the goodness of the arguments given. But now I hope it's clear why this is a mistake. An argument is a collection of claims linked by relations of logical entailment or support. The plausibility or implausibility of those claims and the validity or invalidity of the argument given isn't determined by facts about the moral character of the person asserting the argument. I grant that in cases like this, it's tempting to make the slide from criticism of a person to criticism of an argument, but that's a mistake. The value of discussing a hard case like this is that if you can see the fallacy here, then you've probably understood the essence of the fallacy. Facts about someone's moral character by themselves don't make it any more or less likely that their arguments are good or bad. So our final assessment is that this is a bad argument, and it's bad because the background assumption necessary to make the argument valid or strong is false or dubious. So it violates the truth condition, as we've defined that term. This might seem like a long-winded way of saying that the argument is fallacious, but the point of this discussion is to show why it's a fallacy, why ad hominems in general are fallacies, by showing how the argument violates one of the basic conditions for an argument to be good. Now, to sum up, we can say a few things in general about ad hominems. When you reconstruct them, ad hominem arguments typically rely on the following types of assumed premise. Almost any claim that a person makes about topic X is probably false because of some feature of that person, or almost any argument that a person gives about X is probably bad because of some feature of that person. If you include the terms in brackets, you get a more qualified version of the premise that would make the argument strong rather than valid. Now, the characterization given here is somewhat broader than your typical abusive ad hominem. You get your typical ad hominem when you base your objection on a criticism of someone's character. But this broader characterization is helpful because it also covers ad hominem cases that don't necessarily involve insulting a person or criticizing their character, as we'll see in the next couple of tutorials. Finally, I want to direct your attention to the whenever in that final statement on the bottom. You commit an ad hominem fallacy when you give an argument that relies on premises of this type, but it's only a fallacy if the premise is false. I want to point this out because, as most textbooks will tell you, premises of this type aren't always false, and in these cases, the arguments don't commit the ad hominem fallacy. Here's an example. Johnny is on the witness stand testifying against Mrs. Jones in a murder case. He says that he saw Mrs. Jones stab her husband. The argument for her guilt relies solely on his testimony. Now, in a case like this, where an argument relies on trusting someone's testimony, facts about a person's character and motives are relevant to assessing the argument. If it's true that Johnny is a known liar, and he has a motive to lie in this case, maybe he himself is a suspect in the murder, then it makes perfect sense to reject an argument that is based solely on Johnny's testimony. So while this argument for rejecting Johnny's testimony does rely on claims about Johnny's character, it doesn't commit the ad hominem fallacy, because in this case, the claim about his character is relevant to assessing the argument. This example shows why we needed to qualify our characterization of the ad hominem in the previous slide. Let's go back to that. We commit the ad hominem fallacy whenever the argument relies on premises like these, and the premises are false. It's a fallacy because the argument violates the truth condition. But premises like these aren't always false. In this case, the implicit assumption we're making about Johnny's testimony is that it's probably false. At least we don't have good reason to think it's true, because Johnny has a record of false testimony and a motive to lie in this case. And in this case, it's a perfectly reasonable assumption. So the argument doesn't violate the truth condition and consequently doesn't commit the ad hominem fallacy. Now, this discussion raises the question of whether there are any general rules for deciding when the relevant assumptions are true or false. Well, to my knowledge, this is still a subject of debate among experts in the philosophy of argumentation. But on a case-by-case basis, it's not hard to spot exceptions to the fallacy. So your best guide, I think, is to look at cases as they come up and ask yourself whether the truth or plausibility of a central premise in the argument really does turn on facts about the arguer. The best examples are arguments that rely solely on the authority or testimony of an individual. But context matters a great deal too.